Oh, and before I start, if any of my, I think maybe some of my students for this are online. So want to give a shout out to Ishrat, who's been leading this project, largely her idea for the whole project, and Tochi, Christopher, and Warren, who have been seminal in sort of getting this up and off the ground. So didn't want to forget them. And also thanks, Lindsay, for the invite. But this is me. I tried to distill this into, one sentence, which is my work focuses on how we can leverage new technologies to create liberatory futures for intentionally exploited communities in real life and online. So I've done this in a couple of different ways. The first was by co-creating Crux, which was the largest cooperative of Black artists working in AR and VR. We did lots of work before the pandemic and then during the pandemic to really support folks and embedding some of the values that we talk about all the time into online spaces as largely arts organizations. That's primarily where we work, but also justice-focused organizations. We're trying to create like that feeling of community online. So we created events that were like really joyful, really accessible, typically not on Zoom, that had captions and ASL interpreters who were completely people of color, because we were largely working with people of color. It's really awkward to talk about race when there's a bunch of white people interpreting and maybe misinterpreting what you're saying. So we tried to really think holistically about what an online experience could be for marginalized communities. So that's one example. Yeah, okay, so this course that I developed was largely came about selfishly, which was I was really interested in DAO and blockchains and don't know anything about it. I'm not technical. So I decided to create a course for students to explore and essentially teach me what they were learning and learning us alongside them. So this Web3 course was really about how creatives finance their work and whether Web3 technologies gave them an opportunity to finance them in different ways, maybe more creative ways, maybe ways that really allowed them to easily share resources across borders or across geography or just across bank accounts. We started the course teaching from a zine that was done. It's called After the Creator Economy. It was done largely by a guy named Austin Roby, who's pretty prominent in the platform cooperative movement. Are y'all familiar with platform cooperatives? Okay, so traditional cooperative, probably familiar with, maybe it's a food co-op, maybe it's a housing co-op, whatever. But platform cooperatives are actually cooperatives that use technology to scale. And so Austin comes out of the punk scene in New York and started a music platform for musicians, whereby their fans and their communities could support their work, largely rising from like the awfulness of Spotify and how they pay creators and other sort of chains like Bandcamp, which recently like got sold and has totally changed their pricing model. It's around the same time that Patreon changed their pricing model to take a lot more from creators. And so Austin's been doing this work. He collaborates a lot with Yancey Strickler, who's one of the founders of Kickstarter. Yancey now started something called a meta label, which it's fascinating, metalabel.xyz, but it allows you to sort of work with your homies to collaborate and produce work and put work out into the world. So all of these people are sort of like floating around, thinking about what happens to creators after sort of like the subscriber model fails. And after the sort of YouTube creator funds, which are funding a lot of creativity, and the like multi-trillion-dollar industry that is creativity that's born on the backs of folks who are largely uncompensated or severely undercompensated for their work. So we started reading from that text, which is free online if you're interested, again, After the Creator Economy. And from there, so that was the first half of the semester, and then the second half, students decided to come together on a project. And for this, it's a brief history of the web. There are people here who are far more qualified to talk about that than me, but I think about Web 1.0 as like the fun web. That's sort of what many of us grew up with, which was like, here's my chat room, and oh my goodness, my mouse is a unicorn, and there's music everywhere, and it's super fun. And maybe it's just like a weird blog, and maybe there's like Comic Sans font everywhere. But that was great. That was like super fun. Web 2.0 to me is like the sad web, which is Facebook has made everything like all of our design choices sort of come from Big Blue Facebook. You've got blogging, some interaction, people are beginning to buy things online, but largely it's that's the internet that's fueled capitalism, right? Like it's hard to think of a technology that we've developed the last 25 years that really wasn't in some way serving technology, serving capitalism. Sometimes I think about e-bikes, maybe that's one. Anyway, we can talk about that, but if anybody has ideas, I'd love to kick them into my brain. This is also where we really start thinking about user experience. So what's the experience of folks online? How are we navigating online? What does accessibility look like? And so Web 2.0, we've learned a whole lot. And on the downside, we've also learned, again, like going back to a lot of what's happening online is funded by artists, funded by creators who are underpaid, who has power. So we're beginning to see power online and the way that we sort of have to find funding happening largely in Silicon Valley. Now it's starting to move a little bit to the Midwest, to Austin, but like largely you have, maybe a small number of people who are funding work, and also sort of funding like our taste, like what we think is funny, what we think is sexy, what we think is interesting. Like there's this whole. That's not just how I think, right? I was like, oh my God, what's happening? Elon Musk has found me, right? Yeah. So like, it's the technical part of Web 2.0, but that's really when we begin to see like who has power and how the technology we build really shift power and agency and taste. And for a lot of us, like we're not adequately represented, even though our labor is really being used. And so there's something like cool about Web 2.0 for some people, but for some of us, it's like something that sort of makes us uncomfortable. And as I've been teaching over the last couple of years, my students in particular, I think, have a really savvy understanding of like the downsides of Web 2.0, whether that's the mental health considerations, whether that's how we've amplified, like how we've changed what work looks like, what our expectations, what kind of like lifestyle do we want to have, what does work-life balance look like? But all these things are largely shaped by like Web 2.0. And then we get to Web 3.0, which is in its very, very nascent stages. Web 3.0 has a couple of things that I'm going to try my best not to talk about. Number one being AI and automation and machine learning. I'm not going to do that. If I do, someone like throw something at me. But it's about content being decentralized, which is like the way that people interact with content means that our expectations will be, when you sit down and play a video game, you're actually making content for the video game, which we see like in Roblox. If we're going to a movie, like we're making content that might like change the movie. So we saw that with a couple of the Netflix things that happened over the pandemic where they're really interactive. What those things don't do necessarily, although Roblox is getting better about this, is compensating people for that level of creativity. But Web 3.0 makes that possible because we can begin to put content on blockchain. So some of this is also VR, which some people consider decentralized. I'm on the fence about that. Ownership becomes big. So you'll hear people talk about NFTs and, sort of digital assets. I prefer digital collectibles as opposed to NFTs. NFTs have become a loaded word, which we'll talk about at the end of this. And then really creators starting to own their own content. For me, as someone who's sort of straddled the traditional fine art sector and the digital art sector, this ownership thing was really core to my interest in this class because we're at a point where, young artists makes a painting when they're 19, and instead of selling 100% of the painting, they can sell 75% of it and retain 25%. And so in 30 years, when they're really super valuable, they still have that 25% that they still own so that whenever it's sold, they can continue to retain that wealth. And that's just one example of what we can do on blockchain in terms of authenticating work and then making sure that work continues, so artists continue to profit from it on the secondary and third markets. I'm from Jersey. I talk really fast. Cool. There's no way I'm going 20 minutes on this, or even 30 minutes on this.
Can we ask questions? You want to
Yeah, totally. No, please. Yeah.
One more step that direction. Or
This one, like this?
You can be over on that.
Yeah. Is this okay? Can you also
Yeah,
hear me
now
now?
they can see.
Okay, good. Yeah, like 10 years ago, I could have like stepped twice, like 2 steps, but then you can't see anything.
It's our technical.
I don't know. I think I might have done something with the clicker.
I'm probably me.
Okay, thanks. Oh, but questions?
But I can wait.
No, go for it.
So on the idea that you sell 75% of a piece of art and then you get kind of each time it's sold, you would get some back. I mean, I think it's fascinating and really cool. Is that happening already? Have people had success with this?
There are some artists primarily in the digital space, so who are most certainly reselling work on chain. It's totally authenticated, that sort of thing. I don't remember when Sotheby's auctioned off a fine art piece. I don't remember if they just stopped the secondary market or if they're going to continue to sort of track that on the blockchain. And some folks have in the last couple of years like started platforms to do that, and then they sort of sputtered out. So there's nothing like, it's not robust yet, but I do think it's a viable place for us to really talk about like how artists and creators retain ownership of their work long term.
I'm sorry, I don't want to monopolize, but just does the buyer who paid the 75%, does it limit the rights of what they can do with it? In other words, if I buy a standard piece of art that I would hang on the wall, like if I'm crazy and want to cut it into pieces, or like whatever I want to spray paint it, whatever I want to do, I own it, I can do it.
Yeah.
Does this now limit that?
That is all decided by the smart contract.
Okay.
And so there are folks who do smart contracts that limit, like govern where you can show something, like publicly versus privately, how long you have to hold on to the piece before you sell it. So all of that can be structured as, part of the contract. I think more and more will probably end up like, if you're going to destroy it, then you probably need to compensate the person who still has, the rest of the people who, are essentially shareholders, right? Just to put it in a different frame.
Lauren, can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah.
I noticed there is a glitch from the pizza order. Who else wants pizza? Seriously, put your hands up. We're gonna order anyway. Seriously, guys, who the like Netflix likes? Salai, I'm hungry. Seriously, now, hands up. All right, cool, thanks. Yeah, just ordered a couple more.
I didn't really dread this, so like if we were formal, I would have been like totally just lost.
Anyway, thanks, Melissa.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
So be at the end, guys. Alfred, I won't be here.
Okay, so these are just some terms for folks who don't understand blockchain. And again, this is something that I'm learning. So by no means am I an expert. We definitely have people who are experts on this stuff. But blockchain is essentially a record of transactions that happens on chain. And the beauty of it is it's peer-to-peer. And with my organizational development hat on, what I think is really cool and what probably has will have implications for like far-ranging fields where perhaps like they didn't, and I think about the nonprofit sector a lot, like where they didn't do Web 2.0 very well in terms of like infrastructure, payment, processing, all that stuff is like, for me, blockchain provides an opportunity for them to be able to build platforms or use platforms where there's a relatively low degree of control, meaning there's not like one person who clicks a button and something happens. Because we all know that person turns into a bottleneck in organizations. But there's a high degree of coordination between various aspects of an organization or a community. So for me, that communication that can happen asynchronously from around the world is really cool about blockchain. We're going to be talking about a DAO that my students are started. DAOs are decentralized autonomous organizations. Ideally, it's transparent. So the way that money comes in should be transparent. The way that money goes out should be transparent, fully viewable on chain. And ideally, members have leadership votes and roles, which again, as we talk about governance, as we talk about things like boards or about power and agency, which we talked about earlier, like Web 2.0 did not have a whole lot of that. DAOs have an opportunity for us to really play around with like all of those things. And, as workers who struggle with varying degrees of lack of power or no transparency into our work or poor coordination or everything else, I can see a world where DAOs really impact the way that we all work in labor. Yeah.
Can I ask a question about that in terms of, I know you guys are creating a DAO, but in terms of DAOs you've explored, is there really that kind of governance? Like when I looked into a few DAOs a few years ago, it was basically a Discord group with a few people that were pretty much deciding, the proposals that everybody was going to vote on. And so it was meant to be like this voting decentralized structure, but it often just ended up being whoever the leadership was putting forward stuff and people voting for it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think again, like DAOs are organizations, right? So if you're in a really, really large DAO, like, Nouns DAO or whatever, like, yeah, you're probably going to have people who have, put a lot of sweat equity into it, have been there from the beginning, who are profiting from it, perhaps more than everyone else based on the voting shares and everything else. In a smaller DAOs, the ones that we've looked at, like there's a lot of coordination, it might be 12 or 15 people. And having some good friends who are both on the collective, like sort of artists, like digital art collective side and on the DAO side. For them, the ability to do an NFT drop, that NFT drop is, 15 artists working together. They're doing $300,000 on that drop. And then the money is automatically dispersed to their 12 or 15 collaborators. Like that's revolutionary. No invoices, no 1099, no like, hey, where's my honorarium? Like, hey, did you see my email about my honorarium? Hey, about the honorarium, you're paying me, right? Like, it's like my life. Yeah, like even that, like at a small size is really transformational for how we organize and how we share resources. Because once the money is there and you're paid, that allows you to be freer with your community, with other DAOs, perhaps you're funding your work in a different way. So much of like our lack of trust in the way we behave is sort of caught up in like the fact that we don't have transparent fast payment solutions, like as a world. And then terms, NFTs, cryptos, crypto, like again, these things have, I'm going to talk about the bad first impression, but like, unless you're deep in the space, chances are you've gone 6 months without hearing anything positive about either one of those two words. Are we just selling JPEGs? Who's going to steal your crypto next? But for the purpose of this discussion, we're talking about digital tokens, digital collectibles that have, for people who have been in the space, have created a lot of wealth, help them hold wealth, help them deal with their taxes differently, and build communities online that continually fund their work. We had a guest in class today who talked about how he feels like his art practice, his collective's art practice is recession proof. Because they have, like, no matter what happens, they know they have a dedicated community of 75 people that when they say they're going to do something, their community is able to support their work. And they've seen that time and time again over the pandemic. So regardless of how you feel about sort of personally and the environmental impacts of NFTs and crypto, it is something that artists are using to have a sustainable livelihood and to really build a thriving creative middle class, which I think we don't talk about enough in terms of like how hard it is to be a middle class artist, not super famous and not poor, but just middle class. You can pay your bills and raise a family. So this is the question that my students started off with. What is a modern day artist collective? We've not totally answered that yet, but where we have sort of landed is maybe it's a DAO. And then, because I had to be a little selfish, this is really what I wanted to get out of the project, which is, can we explore how ownership, wealth creation, and sharing resources at a beginning of a career for a student, does the ability to do that shift the student's relationship to their work long term? So if we're talking about a DAO, something that students can own and build worth, does that mean that they feel like they can pursue a PhD? Does it feel like they can pursue becoming a full-time influencer, a full-time videographer, or pursue careers that perhaps have a really bad reputation in terms of being able to have an affordable lifestyle? Sorry, I'm struggling because I have a laptop that was recalled and I'm seeing typos everywhere. My keyboard doesn't work, but I have to like find the time to not use it to send it back for 2 weeks. And who's going to do that? Anyway, what can a DAO tell us about community engagement and development of social norms, both online and in real life? So one thing I'm really interested in is like, how do we behave? So many of us, like the number of trolls that are online versus the number of people we know who troll in real life, like there's a disconnect there. Obviously, we know some trolls. People don't behave that way in real life. And so how do communities develop? What norms become, how do norms develop and what are the norms? How do we develop core values? And what can we learn about the way that core values are developed online and translate that into real life? Because so many of us are living inside of behavioral norms. We were talking when I showed up earlier. I'm sorry, I forgot your name. What was it again? Riz and Aliris was saying in my videos, before I started ASU, I did visual descriptions. And a lot of my you know, a lot of my videos because I was working with a lot of people who had low vision, or it was just sort of a cultural norm that I was working with. And I stopped doing that at ASU because it's not a cultural norm here. But like those sorts of like little norms that pop up in spaces, I think are so interesting. And then as you're code switching between spaces, figuring out how to behave, I think is really important. And all that stuff is happening in real time. So whether that's we're all of a sudden taking classes online because of a pandemic, or we're spending a lot of time in digital environments and in the metaverse, like these norms haven't yet been written. And I'm curious to see how it functions in a DAO. And then can DAOs and other blockchain technologies be scaled to change how we organize for education, mutual aid, real estate ownership, and other large social issues? So I've been thinking for years, like, what if college was a cooperative whereby like a group of 10 students starts it and they use their federal student loan money to like fund that first bit. And then when they leave, the next group of students comes in and pays off their debt with their new debt. And so in essence, you just have this ever-going sort of Ponzi scheme of federal student loan debt that funds education. Like we could theoretically do that on blockchain. But like, I'm really interested in like, because that's what it is, right? And then our federal student loan debt funds large real estate enterprises, which none of us work for right now. So that's the sort of thing that I'm like really interested in with this project. And it's been really cool to talk to my students about the potential of like how we fundamentally rethink social structures with new technologies. So my students' vision is really for content creators to have equitable access to the tools they need to be successful. We started off really, we had a really critical discussion early on in class because the After the Creator Economy book talked about how low the barrier to entry is for content creators. And I was like, do y'all think that's true? And they were like, no, you need high quality cameras, you need computers, you need studio space, you need all these things that most of us don't have access to pretty easily. So like reading that critically actually got us to this particular project. This slide does not match because we presented this earlier and I was like, oh, I forgot about this slide. It's great. So my deck design's off, but whatever. So my students mapped artifacts to the ASU charter, which I thought was really cool. And so the charter mentions leveraging our place and using ASU's real estate availability. And we've spoken to people around the university about like, what space is available that's not currently being used or is underutilized? Can we have that and turn it into a space where like our DAO could live and have, you know, equipment in there and like workshops and really build community? So that allows us to leverage our space. Socially embedded. The resources are available will provide individuals within the local community create a place to safely create without having to invest in high-end equipment. What we've learned in our conversations with faculty and other staff members is that ASU has a whole lot of creative equipment all over the place. It seems like the only place students actually know what's available and feel like they have really easy access to it, meaning there are no gatekeepers, no fiefdoms, is over at Mix, which is really, but Mix is just, that's what it's for. But we've learned like there's a whole like podcast content creation studio with like a ton of new video equipment over and like downtown campus in an office building like nobody apparently knows about or nobody uses. So we've got like a whole list of spaces that we could activate. Maybe it's for a pop-up, maybe it's for longer term, but ideally it's providing a mechanism for students to be able to access the space, to know that the space exists, and then to be able to share resources and knowledge. Inclusiveness, lowering the barrier of entry. Sometimes barriers of entry are just knowledge. Like you just don't, like the space is not visible and the equipment is not visible or bookable. So that's a barrier. But regardless, the barriers that we lower allow people to create regardless of their socioeconomic status. And again, that goes back to just the high cost of equipment. And then transform society. My students believe that, you know, a decentralized organization can transform society. And I tend to agree with them. I think interacting with a community for ownership and learning new skills and building wealth, I feel like if I had that as a young undergrad or grad, even as like while I was in law school, would have fundamentally changed my relationship to work and to like what I felt was possible for my own personal career. So the actual offerings for the DAO, we'll have audio offerings for folks who want to do podcasting, also for our voice actors. And for music recording or sort of ADR, which are like the sounds people make in movies. Visual, so having a small sound stage where people can actually, you know, record videos, do some fun stuff, maybe do some video game acting, or just film shoots, camera recordings would be cool. And then digital, which is where the real expense comes in. which is around just the level of, computing equipment you need for the 3D work that a lot of the students over at Mix are doing. And streaming, which takes up a lot of computer processing. And then YouTube or video game content creation. As of right now, and this is all being worked out, but this is what our initial thoughts are, is that it would work because the students are all co-owners and have equal standing. But Riz, going back to your experience, I'm curious to see how this plays out. It's like a big group project where like 3 people do a lot of the work. And so I'm curious about this. Ishrad, if you're listening, I'm curious about this.
Also, my question is like, did they offer individual NFTs? Can they allocate them differently to individual artists, or is it based on the ownership?
So one thing that we've talked about is like that the difference between offering a digital collectible and then sort of giving people points. So like in the initial stage of marketing this, right? So one thing we're thinking about is like, do we throw a party someplace? And then, people come to the party, we get a great DJ, drinks, whatever, just to sort of talk about the DAO. And then if you share the invite to the party, do you get points, or do you actually get like an NFT that we're generating, digital collectible of some sort? We're not quite sure. And then like, what's the difference between that and then membership in the DAO? So we haven't quite figured out those economics yet, but it's something that in particular with our TEED speakers the last 2 weeks have really come up as like something we hadn't really thought about, but that we need to get tighter on. Students don't have to have cash to do this. So if you are, so it's tokenization, again, no barrier to entry. So if you are a student and you want to, you come to a workshop, you mint your first NFT in one of our workshops, and then you decide to give that particular NFT or digital collectible to the DAO, that's a way that you can access space. So really trying to like get rid of the fact that you have to have money to be a content creator. Like you can create to be a content creator. And this isn't new stuff. I mean, like European countries allow you to like donate art for tax instead of paying taxes, right? Like I get it. But in the United States, like having the ability to access services, resources, and knowledge without money is actually kind of radical here. Right. And then here we go with the board. So there'll be a board to help with sort of administration. Again, this is all fuzzy. We're still figuring out how to work. But ideally, like some of the administration overhead would be shouldered by people who are like really compensated for their labor and something other than studio space. So here are our roadblocks. Right now, we're trying to figure out how to sort of seed fund the project. ASU has a blockchain research lab. We've got like, we accept the foundation, accepts cryptocurrency, and yet it's not quite transparent to me how / whether the rules are about like a project using crypto or using student, like converting like university dollars or what's in my startup account or my grant account into crypto to actually fund the first level of the DAO. So noodling through that. And that's something that we have to figure out because the initial sort of, it's probably about $2,000 for us to like even begin to really play with DAO technology or DAO platforms. So unless we're going to do something that we code totally custom, which is going to take a while and also has a pretty steep learning curve, and also the UX might be kind of funky, like that's something that's a roadblock for the project right now. And then going back to just general bad first impressions, there are words that have become like poison. NFTs are one of them. Crypto most certainly. When you start talking about how you're going to hold it, what your wallets are, everyone refers to like FTX and what's happening in that space. And I also think the environmental impacts for students of like, because if you've been following, there's a pretty significant, in particular, the previous iteration of blockchain, there was a pretty significant energy burn on minting things. So sort of trying to get over the bad first impressions and figuring out like the meaningful language to describe what we want to do has also become a barrier that like we're really talking about. Here's how you can follow us on various platforms. It's just that you do, because I'm here marketing this thing. And that's pretty much the talk about the work.